So Detroit went bankrupt in the last couple of weeks, and a number of people have been drawing the parallels between Detroit and Starnesville from Atlas Shrugged. Starnesville, if you remember, is a town that basically was built around 20th Century Motors, this motor company that was incredibly successful and then was taken over by the Starnes children and turned into this Marxist utopia where everybody got based on what they needed and everything was taken based on what you created. So this communist utopia, and of course Starnesville, the town, is completely destroyed. The factory, of course, goes bankrupt, and the town is completely obliterated. It becomes the poorest place one could imagine. And there certainly are strong parallels between that and between Detroit, if not the specifics, the general attitude. So Detroit is a city where promises were made to people who needed it, particularly state employees, the poor more generally, promises that could never be fulfilled, and promises that were made on the backs of whom? On the backs of the able, the productive, generally the middle class, the business community, the wealthy. Of course, those promises had to be paid for, which meant higher taxes, greater redistribution of wealth. As a consequence, because Detroit is just a city, people moved into the suburbs. And even today, one of the amazing things about Detroit is that you drive away from Detroit, you drive into the suburbs. The suburbs are not part of the actual city of Detroit. You see a lot of wealth. You see a lot of development. You see people thriving. All the people who used to live in Detroit, I think at the peak 1.8 million, today it's down to 770,000. All those people moved out into the suburbs. They were driven out by higher taxes, no attention paid for them. There's even a story of when they try to cut a deal to bring jobs into Detroit, supposedly. They cut a deal with General Motors, and they used eminent domain to build this huge new General Motors plant within the city limits of Detroit. And they positioned that plant in a middle-class neighborhood, destroying hundreds of homes. And all those people whose homes were destroyed because of eminent domain moved, and they moved out of Detroit. There's this attitude of, where the city government despised anybody who was successful, anybody who had wealth, and therefore drove those people out by increasing the crime rate, increase the taxes, using eminent domain, an educational system that deteriorated dramatically. And in that sense, this very much mirrors Starnesville. In the name of redistribution of wealth, in the name of some social agenda, penalize the able, penalize the productive for the sake of the unproductive, the people who are not able. Now, all of that happened in Detroit, and of course we're seeing the consequences of it today. But we've really been seeing the consequences of that for 20 years. People don't realize this, but Detroit has received federal money for the last couple of decades. A third of all Detroit employees, city employees, were being paid off by federal grants over the last 20 years. There's been this massive bailout of the city, and that didn't work. Let me just point out one thing, which is just generalizable to many city governments and many state governments in the U.S., and that is what the public employee pension funds do. The public employee pension funds basically squeeze the local government for more and more and more benefits, higher and higher pensions. The politicians don't mind giving them those pensions because by the time they're paid out, they will all be out of office. This is loading up future generations. And of course, at some point you have to pay the bills. And Detroit and cities like Chicago and many other cities have now reached the point, a couple of cities here in California that have recently gone bankrupt, have reached a point where those bills are being paid and there's not enough money to pay them. So the cities are going bankrupt, and they're going to have to cut their pension promises. They're going to have to cut, the health care promises they made their pensioners. And of course, the unions and many on the left are flipping out. You can't cut these promises made. Well, of course you can. These were promises made on the backs of taxpayers, made by politicians, corrupt politicians that have now left office. And in bankruptcy, it should all be on the table. Indeed, I believe that these kind of pension plans, defined benefits pension plans for city employees should be outlawed. City employees should not be able to load up benefits at the expense of future taxpayers, at the expense of future generations, and where the benefits are clearly defined. They should move just like most corporations have moved to defined contribution, 401k-like pension plans. So absolutely everything about this is straight up Atlas Shrugged. This is a consequence of altruism. This is a consequence of the corruption that altruism leads to, and the complete perversion of government, not as you being your servant, not as protecting you, not as not as defending your rights, but government as a leech, government as violating your rights, government as not doing the job it's supposed to do, protect you from criminals, but government is primarily a mechanism to redistribute wealth. The similarities between Starkville are obvious because the philosophy driving both what happened in Detroit and what happens in Atlas Shrugged is the exact same philosophy.